Okay, looks like we're streaming. Okay, cool. So how's everyone doing tonight? Any burning questions from yesterday? Nothing? Don't know where Waldo is, probably in some book, but I know he's on every page. Let's see. All right, so last night's homework, I see a bunch of awesome forks happened. That's great. Good news there. So I'm going to do a little recap real quick of what we went over yesterday. And actually, before I do that, someone had left a comment regarding kind of like code style, like coding style, and when to be verbose or when it's needlessly verbose or anything like that, and kind of trying to figure out that kind of comes down to the question of coding style or the topic of coding style and when it's a good idea to be verbose and versus like saying being clever. And what I mean by clever is, let me share my screen real quick. So here I have two functions that do the exact same thing. First one, sum reduce, just takes an array of stuff. It's expecting an array of objects where each object has a value property on it, and that value is a number. And then it's going to iterate over the whole thing, and it's going to sum it up into one number, and it's going to spit out that number. It's going to spit out the sum of all of these numbers here. It just so happens to be the value 42. Sum for each does the exact same thing. It iterates over everything, adds them all together, and spits out the final value. Both expect the same type of data structure coming in, and both give out the exact same data structure going out. But looking at this really quick, which one at a glance do you think you could figure out what it's doing? Where is my, hold on a second. I gotta change my gallery view. Look at chat. Right, so the for each one, the second one. Why? Well, you can kind of see how it's split out, right? We're being purposefully verbose. We're saying, okay, well, here's the original sum. It's nothing yet. We're going to go over every single item. Sum is going to be equal to this stuff, and then we're going to return the sum. Now, with this one here, the reduce function does the exact same thing. But if you weren't familiar with it, or even if you are familiar with reduce, you have to kind of investigate it a little bit further to figure out what's going on, right? So being a senior developer, I would look at this and go, okay, they're reducing. So now I got to put on this specific, reduce hat, and I got to think through how reduce works. Or if I can come down to this and I can say, oh, here's what we're doing. That's fine, right? Now, both do the same thing. Both are acceptable code. But you have to kind of figure out, or when you're coding, you have to kind of think about who is going to be looking at this code down the road. Is it going to be you? Is it going to be someone else? You know what I mean? Like, so what makes the most sense? Well, what code has more clarity to it? So, and not just about, is it you that you're going to be looking at this code later on? Future you might be like, well, I haven't reused reduce in a year. What does that do again? Right? So just think about those sorts of things when you're thinking about if you're being needlessly verbose versus being clever, right? Now, there's always like a happy medium. I err on the side of clarity, but reduce is a very powerful function. And as long as you comment what it's doing, I have no problems with someone using it. But I wouldn't compose like 5 different reduce functions into one and expect, someone to actually get what's going on without, breaking it down piece by piece. So it's okay to do this down here. versus this. There's no issues with that. It really comes down to coding style, but people are going to know how to work with your code more when you go this way versus if you're always doing something like this. Sound good? All right, so I just wanted to address that really quick because you can be clever in React because React's just a bunch of functions. So at the end of the day, this thing could technically spit out a function and you'd have no idea what the heck it's doing, right? Whereas if you were to loop over everything that's going into this thing and render components that way, it'd be a lot clearer and people have an easier time working with your code. All right, so tonight, before I get started on tonight's topics, I want to kind of recap what we went over yesterday. So we talked about importing and exporting. I think we're good there. I think we all know the difference between a default export and a named export, right? So names, you're using the curly braces to import it. Defaults, you're just giving it a variable name without the curlies and you're importing it that way. Exporting it, you use the default keyword versus throwing the export keyword in front of like a variable name or a function. You can do either or. Both of these are named exports. We talked about folder and file naming. So the name of your file matters, especially in React. It's a lot clearer for someone that's used to it to know what's going on. If I see this file here heading, I know it's a component or at least has a component in it because it's capitalized. And I can probably wager that the name of that component is the name of the file. Whereas something else might just be, okay, well, this might be some utilities or some other JavaScript function that's not a component. And for some reason, when I saved my, when I closed my browser yesterday, half my files that I was working on either got renamed or disappeared from my Code Sandbox repo. So that was weird. But so message before was actually, we capitalized this, right? And that tells me that this CSS file is tied to this component just by virtue of its name. So we went over that. We went over JSX. So we have our tags that look like HTML tags. We have a starting and a closing tag for components or elements that don't require any children. We can self-close those just like this. The other tag that's an HTML that's also self-closing is an input. Input does not have a closing tag. This is incorrect, right? So it's not the correct syntax. So input tag is one of those few tags that has, it's always a closing tag, but feels like it could be something else, but it doesn't really take any children. It takes values. Let's see, we talked about components versus elements, right? So elements are just like the building blocks of your application structure, whereas components, so elements are like single units, whereas components are usually collections of elements of other units, and they typically include logic. They can accept props, they can accept children. So we went over the difference between, not between, but we went over props and children as well. So we can pass like attributes to this thing, right? So we can pass a class name to it, give it a class name, and then we're expecting that this component knows how to handle that, right? Which in this case, it does, but it doesn't actually accept it. So props, we're going to evaluate props, that class name, right? So what this says is, oops, let me close all these erroneous files. So in heading, we're declaring we're not declaring, but we're using a message component. We're passing it a prop of class name. That prop has a value of the string Peru. And inside here, well, let's get rid of this. Inside here, it's like, okay, I know that I have a props object coming in. One of the properties on that object is called class name. I'm going to plop that right here. I can plop that anywhere into my component, and I can utilize that data coming in. The same thing goes with children, right? So if we wanted to add children, we would add a closing tag. Get rid of this. we could say, this is my message. Check. And then let's import this thing so we actually see what's going on. Let's get rid of these styles. So all we want to see is this. And then import that into app. I'm going to do a named import. Components, heading. Here's our heading. We don't really see anything yet because even though we're rendering message and we're passing it children, we're not doing anything with those children yet. So we need to go into the message component and use the special props.children to see it pop up. All right, so that's just a recap. Any questions on everything that we went over yesterday in any of this? Or do we feel that we're good right now? So, or give me a thumbs up. I see thumbs up. Awesome. Fantastic. Cool. So just knowing what we know now is like a fantastic foundation to everything else we're going to do. It may not seem like we've done much, but we've done quite a bit. So as long as you get these concepts, everything else kind of builds on all of it. And so that's really good to hear. Okay. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about React hooks. Specifically, we're going to talk about state, application, or component state. We'll briefly talk about application state. And then we'll also talk about effects, like EFF, ECTS. Effects. These are things that happen as a result of something else happening. So that you can think of it like a function that's just waiting to be called. It's waiting for a certain event to happen. And then this effect is going to happen because of that event, right? So we're going to think about it that way. We're kind of like, we're reacting to things. You can throw in a nice pun there. All right, so also we're going to talk about arrays, how we can work with arrays inside of React. Super, super helpful, used extremely often, more often than you think. Event handling. So when a user does something with our application, that will trigger some sort of event. We want to be able to respond to that. We want to handle that event and what happens after that. We're going to talk about working with data. So say data coming back from an endpoint. That's going to tie into effects quite nicely. And then if we have time, we'll talk about routing. So let's say you have an application, it's a single page application, but there's 3 pages to it, right? So what I mean by that is by single page application means you don't navigate to another URL to get to more parts of the application, right? So the URL at the top will not change, at least not the base URL, right? So there's no more HTML documents that you're going to be opening. Every new page is another React component, basically. But instead of it being another page, it's just rendering a different component. Now, the URL, I kind of lied, but the URL does update, but you're not going anywhere. You're just telling the application that, hey, I should be at this location in the application, but really I'm still on the same page. It's just React's rendering different things to the screen. Okay, so it's very different from, say, an application that's built with Microsoft.NET technology, which I worked with a lot extensively for the last 5.5 years. And basically it says, okay, if you want to go to a different part of this application, you have to go to a very different HTML document that's at a different URL. And that's a different page. So it's kind of like when you navigate like a blog. So you're going to, blog/events or blog/contact, right? Those are different HTML documents, most likely. That's a different part of that whole quote unquote web application, right? That web page is a different page altogether. With React applications, you don't have to do that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end. I'm going too far into it already. I can talk about that stuff all day. So let's go start with the first thing we want to talk about, which is hooks. So because you haven't touched React before, I do have to preface hooks with talking about two different types of components. Now, there are function components, which is all we've seen so far. So we can see this is a function. Clearly, that's a function signature. It's an arrow function. If I can do the exact same thing, we'll say export function message 2, and I'll just return the exact same thing. Take props. This will do the very same thing that this is doing. The only difference is that this is declared with a function keyword, and this is an arrow function, borrowing all the different intricacies of arrow functions. So I'm going to import message 2, make a copy. This is my second message, and we'll make this message 2. Clearly, it's rendering fine, right? So a function component, whether it's an arrow function or use the function keyword, is a function component. That's how it's created. There's another type of component that are class components. These are created using the JavaScript class keyword, that reserved word. Now, I haven't done class components in a little while, so because there's really only one reason I would use a class component ever again, and I'll get into that later, but 99.99% of all of the React I do is all function components. And I'll get into that reason why. So if we want to use class components, we have to import the React, make sure the React library is imported at the top. And this is an NPM package, the React NPM package that's installed. So if I go down to my dependencies, I can see right here, there's React. I keep hovering over the thing. There's React, React DOM, React scripts. I'm importing all of React from the React module, or from the React NPM package, right? So anything that's contained in this thing is now here. So I can actually access certain things on that. I can say React dot, and I'll get a whole slew of things that I can do with it, right? The one thing that I want to do is I want to create a class component. And you don't have to follow along with this if you don't want to. I'm only briefly going to touch on this because you'll probably still see these kind of like out in the wild. There's still a lot of people that use class components that haven't converted over to function components completely. So they still exist out there. So I want to make sure you're aware of them. And it's also good to know why they existed in the first place. So let me just show you the syntax. So we're going to say, I'll export it. Export class message class. And don't worry about this, extends React.component. And I'm going to have a constructor, which takes props. Don't worry about all this. It looks really confusing. Oh, it probably doesn't need this, right? Yeah. Now we'll do this. We'll say state. I'll make it not useless. Okay, and I'm going to have a render. I'm going to return. Now this is be like, oh my gosh, this looks terrible, right? Another reason why people really love function components now. So I'm going to return this same stuff, except there we go. This that props. Wonder why that is complaining. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is what a class component looks like. Underneath the hood, React is saying, okay, you're using this class syntax to create stuff. Cool. So how do you remember, did you talk about classes with, I think you talked about classes with Gus. I think you kind of went on a rant about it, how classes are terrible, don't ever use them, right? So this is another reason why people don't like classes. Some of this logic that's being used with classes is kind of hidden away, and it's not very apparent what's going on. So what's happening here is React saying, oh, I see you're using the class syntax to create a component. That's cool. I'm going to use a function underneath the hood with this class as its template, and then I'm going to spit out a component, right? And that you maybe think, okay, well, why is it doing all that stuff? Because classes are ridiculous. But in the beginning with React, there were two types of components. There's these function components that we use and the class components. And the main reason there was class components is because they could hold something called state. They could hold values within themselves that only pertain to that instance, right? So if you're creating a new JavaScript class, I would create a function, let's say like my class, right? And then I could have properties on that thing. Maybe I have, let's say the value. I even forgot how to do the class syntax, but let's just say value equals 2. See, I'm not even doing it right. But this class can hold values that will only exist in this class when you create a new one of those classes. So to create a new my class, you'd say like new my class, and you'd call it, and what you'd get back, I'll just use a var, my thing equals a new version, a new instance of this class. So it's a new copy of this class, right? So the animal thing is usually a good thing. So animal, a new animal, we'll just say a dog, right? Because a dog's an animal. I could do this a lot of different times. Dog 1 and dog 2. The data that exists inside this animal is, they have the same property names, but it's different values from this one. So this can have its own values. This could have its own values. And that exists in JavaScript. So React said, hey, we're going to use that concept so that we can manage properties inside our components, and we can have as many components as we want of the same type, but they'll each have their own separate values. And so we don't have to worry about the same value showing up in every single component everywhere, because that's just weird. Because not every component is going to receive the same value. Same right over here. This is my message is different from this is my second message. They're this, well, now these are technically different components, but if I go back here, just change this to message, they're both using the same component, but they're separate instances of that component. As far as JavaScript's concerned, these are two different things, right? They have two different sets of values, even though they came from the same template, okay? And so class components was a structure that JavaScript already had that they could take advantage of, and so that's why they did that. Function components originally were called stateless functional components, and that means you can render stuff, but they can't hold any state. Okay, so if I go to, and what do I mean by state? By state, I just mean properties of this component that are inside itself that it has access to. Okay, so if I were to import message class, because again, this is just doing, I'll put this back. So we have all the different things on the screen. Let's say message class. And we'll pass it, my class thing. Here it is. It's doing the same logic. And what is it doing? It's taking, well, actually, this is a perfect example right here. We'll say class name equals Peru. This.props.class name. Oh, forgot the S. Okay, so now they're all doing the same thing. But this is passed in as a prop. What if I want to hard code that value? Or maybe I only want that value to exist inside this component. I don't need it passed in. I already know what it is. So I could say this.state. I could give it some object. Same way props are objects. State is usually an object, usually. You can have it be anything, but typically 99% of the time, it's probably an object. And so I could say class name, and we'll just say blue, which doesn't really exist anywhere. So let's make that happen. So now it exists in the application. Get rid of this, close that. Okay, so we have state inside this component. It has a property called class name, the same as props. But you see here, I'm accessing this class name property via props. If I say this dot state, now it's going to apply the value from state instead. So I could have two of these different components. My second class name. I could pass in this class name all I want, but it's only going to use the value inside this right here. And this class name blue is, oops, sorry. Yeah, the state.class name blue here is different from the state.classroom blue here. Even though there's the same value, those are different instances, right? So they're actually technically different things. And each component knows how to manage those things. They know how to determine, React knows how to determine which component has which values because each class manages its own data. Does that make sense? Kind of like each animal can manage its own internal functionality. Maybe that's not a great example, but a great example would be like a car, right? So every car works the same way, but internally they're different. Like a Ford engine is different from a Chevy engine. So the state of that engine in each car is different, even though they're both built upon the car template, right? So you can think about it that way. So they just manage their own internals. All right, so class components were a way to hold state. And they could also do things like respond to different, what are called lifecycle events. So every time the React application renders, there's an event that happens, and that event is the mounting event. So the specific name of that, that lifecycle, they were called lifecycle methods or lifecycle hooks. That was called component did mount. And that's a function. Okay, so every time this component mounts to the DOM, like when React renders the elements that it creates out of this component and renders the elements to the DOM, this function will be invoked. So I could say console.log. I am here, right? So every time this component mounts to the DOM, that's going to fire. But it's only going to fire once until it goes away and comes back again. And what I mean by that is when a component's on the screen, it's only ever mounted once, right? So this component can receive new values all day long, but if it never gets destroyed out of the DOM, then this will never fire again. This only happens once. It's whatever first mounts to the DOM. If you wanted something to happen continuously, every time the component updates, you could do something there, right? And then this actually takes some props, which is like the previous props, I think the next props. It's been a while since I've used it. So every time this fires, we'll have access to the props that came in before it was updated, and we'll have access to the props that are coming in now that it has updated, and then we can, do whatever we want here, right? We can respond to that sort of stuff that's coming in, or before that's, while that stuff was leaving, we can have access to it. But you have to define all these different things. And this class components start to look pretty confusing. They get to be pretty big. Function components were nice because, look at this. This is all I'm doing. That's great. But how do I get access to state? There's no like this dot state equals whatever inside of here, because the value of this is not guaranteed to be this component. And that's just the nature of functions, right? Versus classes. So when you're inside a class, the keyword of this refers to the instance of that class, unless you pass in something to change it. By default, for functions, this refers to the thing that called it. That's the default. So if something else called the function, this is completely different. It's not that function. It's not that instance of that component. So it's out of the water. It doesn't work. This doesn't work. So that's why class components were created, so they can handle state. Now, React knows we have a way of using state inside of function components, and that's called hooks. So let's do this. Let's start a brand new component. If you want to follow along, this will be good. Good typing practice. Let's call this, actually, what's wrong in here? Oh, it can't do that. We'll go along with the theme of message, but we'll call it something else. We'll call this headline.js. And maybe that's a bad example too. Yeah, we'll go with it. Already created the file. So we're going to create a component, a function component, and we'll do export const headline, and this equals, it's going to accept props just like any other component. And we're going to return some JSX markup. So we'll return a div. And inside this div, we'll have an H1. This headline maybe will be extra special and have a sub headline, subheading. So this is the title. This is the subtitle. And then let's see, we want to accept, let's say that our headline doesn't change. It's always the same headline. We'll just put my headline. And the value of this comes from props. We'll just say sub. I shouldn't have called it headline, but okay. We'll just say subtitle. My title. No, yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter. So we've got this headline. It's got a title and a subtitle. Let's import that into our app. We're going to import a named export called headline from components headline. And instead of all this stuff, we'll just change this just to be headline. Boom, we've got a component. We can see our title. We don't know what our subtitle is yet, right? Because we hadn't passed it in. So subtitle equals, yeah, my subtitle. Okay, cool. So we have this working component that's working with props. You know what? Let's also put in, let's have it work with children as well, just so we can see everything all at once. So we know what is what. So we'll say all my children. And yes, I watched that show growing up. Let's see. My mom forced me to. Not really. I got sucked into it. Let's see. So we'll say props.children. So now we're rendering the title, subtitle, and the child. Anything that's a child of this component. Cool. So now, how do we use state inside here? Let's say that I don't want this just to be some text. Let's say I want to store that in state. Well, I can't just do this.state anymore because it's not a class. So to do that, we have to import from React. We're going to import something called use state. This is a hook. Any hook starts with the word use because you're using that hook to do something. That's the convention. You can create your own custom hooks if you want to, and we can talk about that later. But I would implore you to always use the key, like the word use in front of whatever it is, because any developer that's looking at your code will instantly know it's a hook. That's the convention. Same way, any developer who looks at this file knows instantly it's a component file. Instantly a component file. Instantly not a component file, right? So that's the convention. So I urge you to stick with that convention. All right, cool. So we've got this use. Let's close this this complaining thing down here. So how do we use state? Well, use state is a function, and that returns some stuff for us to use. So we call it just like a function. We're going to say const, and don't worry about the syntax right now. I'll explain it in a second. All right, so what use state does is when you call it, it takes a default value. Think of this as the value that's going to be inside of this dot state as soon as the component launches, as soon as it mounts to the DOM, right? So that's the default thing that's going to be inside our state variable, essentially. Now, what use state passes us back are two different things, and they pass us back an array of two different things. The first thing they pass us back, I think it's technically 3, but we'll get into that later. I think. Anyway, so the first thing that passes us back is a reference to that value. So we'll just say title. And you can call this whatever you want. I could call this, Monopoly game. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that this variable, whatever you call it, is going to hold the value of this piece of state. Okay. The second thing it passes is what's called an updater function. And what that does, I'll say set title. This function, you can call that function to update the value of the piece of state later on when the component's doing different things, or when the user is interacting with that component, okay? So the first thing, it gives you back an array. The first element is a reference to the value of that piece of state. The second is a function that allows you to update that value. And we'll see that in a little bit. So now all I have to do is reference this right here, just like I would render any other variable in JSX. Wrap curlies around it and put the name of the variable right inside. Now I have access to it. So we could just do this, right? First time it mounts, there you go. So that's essentially the same thing as this dot state dot whatever the variable name is in a class component. But look how much simpler this is. What did I do? I have a function. In the body of the function, I have reference to a variable, and I'm returning some markup. That's pretty simple, right? Look at this component. Doesn't look so simple to use, right? So that's the fantastic part about function components. And the fact that now we can use the same functionality that was in class components with function components, why would you want to go back? At least that's my thinking. Some people really like class components, and React's not getting rid of them anytime soon, so you don't have to worry if you really like that syntax. And there is one really good reason to use a class component, and that's what's called an error boundary. There's a special component that can catch errors inside your React code. But the only way you can use it was with a class component. So that's really the only last reason to use a class component. And if we have time at the end, we can talk about it. But everything we do going forward is only going to be function components, because typically that's what you're going to mostly see. The reason I'm illustrating class components is, of course, one, you'll still see them out in different repositories out there. And two, it's good to know why this exists in the first place and why this syntax exists in the first place. The nice thing about hooks is that they're just another function. So React is all about, and I wanted to touch on this yesterday, but we kind of ran out of time. I wanted to touch again on composition. So composing your React stuff isn't just, placing things inside of other tags. That's composition, right? Composing the way your document looks. But the power of the composition that I really want to go over is how you can compose different functions together. Functions can be composed together to produce, some fantastic results. You can pass one function to another, to another, to another, and you can get back a single result. At the end of the day, if you remember, all of these elements and components that we're creating, underneath the hood, they're just functions. This is a function. that gets returned to this function, that gets returned to this function. All these functions are composed together to form this giant, function composition, right? And so since functions can be passed around like values, like any other value in JavaScript, that makes them highly versatile and reusable. I can reuse a custom hook in any of my components that are functions anywhere. You can't use hooks in class components because, well, they only exist because functions needed the same functionality. So you can't use them in class components the same way you can't use this.state in function components. So they each have their own path. But what's nice about this is I can use this anywhere I can use a function, which is pretty fantastic. The other thing I want to show you is this updater function. So let's say I have, and we're going to touch upon event handling really quick on this, but we'll get into more of it a little bit later. So I have a button that says, let's say it says update title. And when I click this, I want this to change, right? This function, this set title updater function is going to allow me to do that. So what attribute on an HTML button is used for calling a function? Anyone know? On click, yes. But we don't write it like this. We write it like this because in React, all these different attributes that you can attach to HTML elements, they're camel cased. So make sure you have your right casing. And this takes a function, but it's not, it's not this. And this is how you do it in HTML. But because we're in JSX, and JSX is JavaScript, we can write JavaScript. So all we have to do is we pass it some curly braces because we're going to evaluate some JavaScript thing. And what we get back, I'm going to write a function up here just to make it clear what's going on. I'm going to say function. We're going to call this handle click. Okay. And we're going to call set title, and we'll just give it, I don't know, my new title, or just new title. That's all we're going to do. So now we can take this function, plop it in here so it has a reference to it. And when I click this, changes. So the value of title, this piece of state called title, changed because I used the function that updates it. And I can pass anything I want into this function. Right? As long as I'm expecting that same type of data type, right? So if I pass, let's say I pass it in array, I click that. Doesn't really look like an array, right? Now, React knows how to handle arrays, and we'll get into that. But what if I were to pass it an object like value 34? Any guesses on what's going to happen? I think we'll see an object. Doesn't work. Why? Because we don't render objects the same way we can render other things in JSX. So, and we'll get into that. But just know that you can pass any value you want in here as long as you're able to handle that value, as long as you're expecting that type of value and handling it the right way. So state can hold anything. And it can even, technically, it could hold other components, even though that's not really a good idea. It gets pretty convoluted that way. But typically, state is usually an object when you have like large components. And you can also have, let me talk about this real quick. Let's say you need one more piece, like more than one piece of state. In a class component, you'd use an object because state is an object in class components, really. And let's say I'd have, title in here. My title, I can't even spell tonight. All right. And then I have like some value 45. If I want to access all these things, I say this.state. Class name, this.state.title, this.state.value, right? That's how I access things in a class component. They're all in the same object. using the use state, I can do it a different way. I could say const value set value equals use state. We'll start with 67. I can come down here. I can run into the value, right? And then I can do two different things. I can just say set value. We'll test in a value of 23. And now I can update multiple pieces of state. I can use as many of these things as I want. I could have 500 of them in here if I wanted to. That's not very readable. Don't recommend it. But technically, I can do that. And so that's another advantage of the use state is I can separate my state out however I want. They don't have to be in the same object if I don't want to, or I could put them in the same object. So let's try that. Let's say that we have, let's comment these out. Comment this out. We'll get rid of these for now. And let's use, after this updates, that's sluggish. All right, so we're going to use a new piece of state, just like the message component class component had. And I'll show you how you can manage an object, a state object, a couple of different ways. So we'll start with we'll call it state. We'll call it set state. And we'll use state. And this will just be, we have an object, we'll have title, high, value 3. So to use this, I'd come down here and I would say state.title, because it's an object, I'm accessing a property on that object. State.value, high 3. Make sense? We have our piece of state is an object. How do we access properties on an object? Like this. So I'm doing the same thing now. So now I'm back to where I was. But a little bit of difference here. With class components, if you were to use some sort of update function to update this and you only target the class name, it knows how to do that. It knows that it's different from these other values. With this, it's a little different. So let's say I click and I use set state. And you know what? I want to change the title property to hello. Save that. Update title. Hello. Hey, that worked. But wait a minute. Where's state.value? It's gone. Why? Any clue? You guys, any hunch on why? Nothing. All right. It's because when we call this update function, we're telling it the next value of state. This next value of state doesn't have a value property. It doesn't exist. I'm replacing this entire piece of state with this thing right here. I could add it. Now when I click it, it's there, right? But, oh, actually that was, yeah. I would have to pass that entire object in order to get the same sort of like behavior that way, right? So I can, there's different complexities of accessing and using and updating state, and this is one of them. So something to keep in mind when you're using different pieces, different data types of state. If I'm going to use an object and I don't want to change the value of all the other properties, I have to do some special stuff. I would say, let's see. Now set state also, instead of accepting just a value, it can also accept a function. And that function, we'll call this update, function, update state. It takes the current state and it returns the new state. So we'll say return an object, hello, oops, sorry. Right, title of hello, and value will be the current state. Now, when I change this, it doesn't change my value, but I had to tell it what to save. There's another syntax you can use for this called the spread operator. Did you guys go over spread operator in the JavaScript module? Rest and spread. I think you guys went over rest. The rest operator, the 3 dots. I see heads nodding. Okay. So this, when you're using a rest operator like this, that means the rest of this stuff, make it into separate parameters or separate arguments that are passed to this function. Okay, so if state, let's pretend that state was an array of 3 values, the rest operator would spread those out as 3 separate arguments to the function. But you can also do the same thing with objects using the spread syntax. And what that does, and let me just get rid of this real quick. I would say ... state. In fact, I'm going to leave it like that. I'm going to click. Let's refresh this. I click this, nothing happens. Well, something is happening actually. I'm updating state, but I'm spreading all the current properties of that state object into this brand new object. So I'm taking all the properties that exist in state now, and one by one, I'm plopping them down into this brand new state object. That's what spread does. So, and spread also works with arrays as well. You can spread arrays over all the elements out in an array. But it's really, really useful with objects. And so all this really means, just whenever you see 3 dots and then something that refers to an object, just know that you're taking every single one of those properties. It's like doing this. It's like saying, okay, I'm going to grab this stuff and I'm going to put it here. That's what spread syntax does, or the spread operator. It takes all the properties of that object and spreads them out into this brand new object. And you get copies of those values. Shallow copies. I don't know if you guys talk about shallow and deep copying. No? Okay. For now, let's just view it as a copy of all the properties with some caveats that we can talk about. But we probably won't get it too deep into that during this module anyway, because we probably won't need to. But what I really want to highlight here is the fact that we can put anything inside our piece of state and then update it. Now, using objects like this, the main reason I wanted to use that actually is I want to spread all the properties of my current state, but I only want to change one thing. And I want to change the title. So what this says, it says, hey, every single property of state, plop it in here. Cool. I'll put them right here. But title, because it comes second, because it comes after this, I want you to overwrite it with whatever I put here. Last in wins. So when you're using the spread operator, just remember that last in wins. It overwrites whatever came before it if it's the exact same property name. If not, it ignores it. Right. So it's gonna take title and value, plop them in here. Value is not going to be touched, but title will be overwritten because I said so. And then now when I click this, I'm updating hello and I'm keeping my value. Make sense? Cool. Yeah, so when should you pass in a value and when should you pass in a function? Here's the rule that I use. If I know that it's just a simple piece of state, maybe it's not this, maybe it's just, a string or a number, I just pass in the value with the new value. If I know that I'm relying on previous state to be carried over, I use the function because I have access to the state before the update is made. That's what this parameter is right here. Whenever this function is called by set state, or by this, I should say the state updater function, it's going to pass the current value of that piece of state so that I have access to it before I return it. Like, to make this even more clear, I would say const new state equals, right? Hello. And then I could say return new state. I have access to the current state so that I can utilize it in my function. And then I can return everything in one line. All that stuff that I did, I now return it. And this becomes the new piece of state. Does that make sense? Is anyone that it doesn't make sense? Yeah. Not really. Okay. So let's go back to, I want to make sure that this is understood because it's going to come in handy. That's very imperative later on. Let's go back to, make sure we're good on time. Let's go back to just the title. And we'll comment everything out that's unnecessary. We'll just have our title. So right now I have, it's updating. It's lagging because Zoom is memory hog. Okay, so I have this use state, which is a hook. And by calling use state, I get back an array of values. The first element in that array is the piece of state that holds the value I want. In this case, my title with some exclamation points. This string of characters lives inside this variable right here. This function, I call it to tell it to change this value so that wherever I'm referencing this thing in my component, it changes at the same time. Okay, so let's see, I am doing handle click, set title, new title. So when I click this, this is the new string that now lives in this variable that gets rendered out in my markup down here. Are we following so far? Everyone following so far? Sort of. After a while, it'll start to click when we start using different things, but let's say well, maybe this will make it a little bit more helpful. Let's get rid of this function here and let's do it in line. We'll say, and we'll use an arrow function because they're pretty concise. Yeah, let's do it this way. So onClick takes a function. It can be a function with a function keyword, or it can be an arrow function. And then inside this function, I want to do one thing. I want to set title from my arrow function. So when I click, what am I missing? Did I delete something? Expected. Oh, I didn't put the last curly brace. All right. So this button takes an onClick handler. I'm passing it an arrow function. And the only thing that function is doing is calling my updater function called setTitle right here. In fact, let's put that way down there so we don't see it. So when I click this, setTitle gets called with this value. Let's say, hey, I see I'm supposed to update this piece of state. Cool. So when you call me, this value in here is going to change to whatever I pass it. I could pass it the value 3. I click it. That new value goes into state. That value lives inside this variable right here. because that's basically what this thing does. It manages these two things right here. That's its sole responsibility in life, is to manage whatever value is in here, and whatever function is responsible for updating this value. Good so far? I'm seeing more heads nod. Good.
Question,
So,
may I?
Yep.
Please. Okay. Const title, set title, etc. In vanilla JavaScript, right? The if that were a function, syntax, whatever, you'd have open parentheses title, open parentheses set title.
Okay, I see.
Is that kind of how I'm thinking of it?
Let me write this a different way.
No, I'm just
No, actually,
that's
that's a very good point. Is because that I take for granted that I'm already very familiar with destructuring syntax, which is what this is doing. Let me rewrite this in a different way.
No, I mean, I just want to understand, make the hook, if you pardon the pun. You got JavaScript and it has like all these different variations on itself.
Yes.
Like you can't decide what it wants to be.
Yep.
And like learning French and Spanish, you start to get the two confused. So I'm just trying to understand who's working on what, but I'm not criticizing your code or anything. Good Lord, no. I'm just kind of lost.
Right. No, that's good. And that brings up a good point. So let's do this. Let's do the same title, my title, or title set title, but let's write it a little different. We're still going to use state because we have to. We're going to say const state array, because that's what useState gives us back, is an array of state and state-like things, equals useState title. All right, so when we're accessing items in array, what syntax do we use? So if I want to say const title equals, and I want to pull the title out of this array, because useState gives me back an array, I know that the value of that piece of state is in the very first element of that array. So how do I pull out the first element?
Have two square brackets with a 0 on the side.
That is correct. So my updater function that sets the new title every time I call it is the second element in that array. Where's that at? 1. So now, everything's working. We're back to where we were. Why? Because this is really what's happening. useState gives us back an array of two things. The first thing being the piece of state that we want, to show to our users or use inside our component. And the second thing is the function that's going to change that value when we tell it to. That's what's really happening there. This is just an array. This right here is the destructured syntax for doing the exact same thing. So what this is saying is it's saying, hey, and I'll call them something different. Equals state array.
Where is the set title array then?
The set title is the second element in this array. Because useState.
But I thought you said the set title function or.
Yes, so set title is a function.
But
that when you call that function right here, you
call that function.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, it doesn't go top to bottom necessarily. Okay, got it.
So when you call this function, you pass it a value, and that value gets transported up to the piece of state, which is the first element of that array. So this syntax with like the square brackets with the set t and set t. This first element, this is the second element. That's how you destructure an array. I could have, and maybe this will make it more apparent. Let's do this. We'll say const items equals 5, 6, and 7. There's 3 things in here, right? If I want to grab out the first item, say const item 1 equals items at 0, right? And I could do the same thing for item 2 and item 3. This is at index 1 and this is at index 2. If I want to pull out the first and second element at the same time, all I need to do is I say const, use my square brackets because I'm pulling from an array. And from this array, I want the first element to be called L1, and I want the second one to be called L2 or L3, or if there's more, right? So what this is going to do is it's going to say, hey, I'm going to create a bunch of constants and I'm going to extract these values out of an array because I'm seeing square brackets. And for each one of those things, I'm going to call the first constant this one, which is at the first element. I'm going to call the second constant this thing because it's at the second element. I'm going to call this constant this thing because it's at the third element. Okay, that's what's happening. Put this down here.
So don't you still need your square brackets 0, 1, 2, yada, yada?
Yeah, so that's what's happening here. I'm saying, hey, oh, let me comment this out so it doesn't yell at me. Use state gives me back an array of 2 things. So I'm going to create 2 constants. I'm going to pull them out of the array. The first one I'll call title, and the first one I'll call set title. I know that the first thing is the value I want, and the second thing is a function that changes that value.
And that's down there. Okay.
Does that help clear everything up?
Kind of. It's a little less murky.
Yeah, it's something you'll get used to over time.
I'm still not comfortable with just good old vanilla strawberry and chocolate JavaScript, so I'm kind of.
Well, I mean,
arrays I get. I love arrays. I seem to be able to handle those. So.
So if you want to, you can write it this way, and it's totally fine if it helps you. Just know that when you're out working on, you get hired somewhere and they're using React and they're using hooks, you're going to see this. I've never seen anyone use it like this ever. This is mostly like for understanding kind of like the workings of how it's really happening. But you'll always see it like this. So it's that's another reason when we're building out this application, I'm only going to write it this way because I want you guys to get used to seeing it like that. But if it helps you while you're practicing to write it like this, so you can grab the concept, go ahead. It's still going to produce the same result. It's just you're being more verbose about it. So this is the needlessly verbose type of stuff that someone was asking about. All right, so do we think we have a good handle on use state at this point, what it's doing? Okay, so I'll pop quiz you guys after the break. Make sure we've got a good understanding. So the next thing I want to talk about is something called effects. And effects are kind of like these things right here that we talked about briefly. These are lifecycle methods. So in the life cycle of a component, whenever it mounts, this thing will be called. Inside the life cycle of a component, whenever it gets updated, this thing will be called, right? So we can manage what happens inside of our component at different states of its life cycles, whether it's being mounted to the DOM, updating, or even being removed from the DOM. There's one for that too. That's component, not that. Component will unmount. So right before it's removed from the DOM, this function would be called and say, hey, I see this component's about to go away. Do some stuff right here before it leaves the screen. Maybe I need to save something off to, maybe I need to cache some data or update something on the screen last minute or whatever, right? Or throw up a pop-up to the user and say, hey, are you sure you want to close me? You know what I mean? Stuff like that. So that's what these things are for, the start, the middle, and the end of the component. And there's more in there, but we don't really need to go into those. Typically, this is about what most people would use anyways. So with effects, let's save this so it's not, with effects, we're doing basically the same type of thing. We can listen for when a component is mounted to the DOM. We can check for when it gets updated. We can even check to see when it's about to leave the DOM. And we can do that inside of functions, the same way we could do that inside of classes. So I'm going to put this down here. We're going to leave this like this. And let's say, let's do this. Let's not give it a default value. There's nothing there. I don't see the title anymore, right? We'll say title, just so we know that there's definitely nothing there, right? It's just an empty string. I could put J there, show. Let's say when this component gets mounted to the DOM, we want to set the title. So we need to listen for that event to happen. And the way we do that is we pull in another hook, and that's called use effect. Again, use because it's a hook, we're using something, and we're using some sort of effect for handling something that happens within the life cycle of our component. And the way we use that is also another function. Remember, hooks are functions. So we have to call the function. Now, use effect is a little bit different than use state. Use state will return us something that we can use throughout our component. Use effect will take a callback and it'll listen for certain events to happen. And when that happens, it'll call the callback. Same the way when you guys were talking about callbacks with when you get responses from data, you'd have a callback to tell it what to do. Something that you would pass to the then keyword, say, hey, call this thing or fetch this data, then I want you to do this thing. Then you pass it a callback. Same thing, same concept here. So we'll say use effect. It's a function, so we can call it, and we give it the callback that we want to have called during specific events. So I use arrow functions, and should get used to seeing these because everyone uses arrow functions with use effects. And use effect takes two different things. The first thing it takes is a callback. The second thing it takes is what's called a dependency list. Now, we'll get into that in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to leave the second parameter off because I don't want to confuse everyone right away. But we give it a callback. It's just an anonymous function. And we want to do something inside this function when the component mounts to the DOM. Well, what do we want to do? We want to set our title. Oh, sorry. Set title. We see hi here. How do we know that that happened when? So I could say console log use effect. And I look at my console. I see that the use effect callback was called. It's right there. Excellent. But we have an issue that we don't yet know about. And that is every time this component updates. See down here, this use effect. See this little blue, I don't know if it's hard, it's probably hard to see, but there's a blue dot with a 7. Now it says 9, 11, 13, 15. That's how many times this use effect was called. Why? Well, by default, use effect will fire every time the component updates, every single time. When it mounts to the DOM, when it gets updated, when it leaves the DOM, every single time it's going to fire. We have to tell it to fire only when we want it to. So if we want it to be executed every time the component updates, we don't have to do anything further. It's going to do it. But if we only want it to fire once, that's where that dependency list comes in. And let's do this to make it a little clearer. Oops, I want to cut it, not delete it. We'll say const callback equals this. Right, so we can clearly see that this is our callback. We'll pass it right here. This is the first parameter of our function, right? We can clearly see that. The second parameter is an array of dependencies. And what that means is this callback will only fire if whatever is in this list changes. So there's nothing in my list. So how many times do you think this is going to be called? 0. No, incorrect. Here's why. Use effect will always fire at least once. Always, 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 always. But in our dependency list, we're listening for things that are changing. And anytime those things change, it'll fire again. Well, our list is empty, so it will never fire again, ever. So that's how we do the same thing with component did mount. Every time the component mounts, this thing fires. Every time the component mounts, use effect will be called. And it will be called again every time something in this list changes. And since there's nothing in that list that will ever change, it will never be called again. It'll only be ever called that one time.
So in effect, in the life cycle of that component or event,
The life cycle of this component,
it's dead.
right? So when this component
Okay.
mounts to the DOM,
Bring it back to life.
yeah, use effect will fire because it fires every time the component mounts, every time it gets updated, and every time it leaves the DOM. But if we pass it that second argument of the dependency array, yeah, it'll be called when the component mounts because it always does, it's guaranteed. But it will only ever be called again if something in this list changes, but there's nothing in the list. So it will never change because nothing will always be nothing, right?
So why do we have it in there?
So that we only fire it once. We're telling it, hey, when the component mounts, I want you to fire, and then I want you to ignore this callback for the rest of the life cycle of this component.
Why?
Because I only want it to fire once.
Why? I'm really trying to understand why it's in there at all.
Because before I wrote it, I said, let's create this functionality right here. This functionality says whenever the component mounts to the DOM, do this thing, but only when it mounts and never again. So what I'm doing is I'm recreating that functionality using hooks. That was the whole premise. That's the quote unquote why. I was demonstrating how you do the same thing. So the why is all depends on what you want the component to be responsible for. So that's up in the air. I can't actually tell you why because you have to tell the component why it wants to do that. That's up to you as the developer. All I'm illustrating right now is this is how you accomplish that sort of thing, right? So let's say, for example, when we start working with data, whenever the component mounts to the DOM, I want you to fetch me some stuff from the server. But I only want you to do it when the component mounts. I don't want you to do it again because I don't want to keep calling the server every single time the component updates. That's ridiculous. I'm going to, flood my server with all these requests. I only want it to call it once. Well, you can use a use effect with an empty dependency list that will only call your function that gets your data once. And that's a very common pattern. And it's something that we'll be doing inside the project that we will be working on next week. Does that clear that up? Perfect. Any other questions on this so far? Does use effect, the way I've explained it, has it made sense so far? Thumbs up. Some people
about the dependencies. If you did want to call it again, what kind of stuff could you put in the dependencies? Other functions or variables, or what could potentially go in there?
I could call it every time props dot I don't know, class name changes. So anytime a new class name gets passed to my component while it exists in the DOM, oh, there's a new class name coming in, call that thing. Or I could say title. That's a very bad idea though. And here's why. If I click this, now it's smart enough to stop me before I create terrible things from happening. But if I want to call this thing every time title changes, what is my callback doing? It's changing the title. So the first time it fires, it's going to say, hey, change this title. Cool. Oh, I see the title changed. Call callback. Oh, change the title. Oh, I see the title changed. Guess what's going to happen forever? Now, Code Sandbox has, and React scripts have some stuff built in that kind of disallows this stuff from happening, so you don't shoot yourself in the foot. But this is one of the biggest foot guns you could have, is by listening for a change in something that you're changing because that's part of the response, right? So we don't want to do that. Just be aware of that. But in fact, there might be even a failsafe within the React library itself to prevent you from doing that. But I've seen similar stuff happen before and wonder, like, why is my program crashing? Why is it, why am I getting these Stack Overflows? And that's usually because there's a reference to itself over and over and over and over and over again. That's typically why. In fact, usually that is the reason why. Okay, so this dependency list determines when this will be called. If this thing changes, we'll call it again. If it's empty, the only time this will ever be called is when it mounts to the DOM, because the use effect is guaranteed always to call at least once when the DOM, when it's mounted to the DOM, always. And then since we're listening to an empty array, we'll never call it again. Make sense? I see lots of heads nodding. Excellent. Okay, so like a go-to loop in BASIC, yes. Yeah, don't do that. We don't want to do that. All right, so now we're coming up on 7 o'clock. So I think we'll take our break at 7. Does that sound good? And for the last 7 minutes, we'll talk about, we'll go into use effect just a little bit more. Let's say, oh, here's a great question that comes up quite a bit. What if, yeah, I want to call this thing, and I want to do it every time props.className changes, but use effect will be called once when the DOM mounts, when it gets mounted to the DOM, and maybe I don't want to do that, right? Well, you could say like, oh, well, when this, I know for a fact, just hypothetically, that class name is empty. It's an empty string, or it's null. Let's say it's null. I know that props.class name is null the first time this thing mounts to the DOM, because you know what, my program is designed that way, right? What if I say, oh, well, if not props.class name, well, if class name isn't there, don't call it. But we've got a problem. And the problem is that you cannot wrap use effects inside of conditionals, or inside of conditional statements. That's not allowed. And there's a very good reason for that. I don't want to get into too nitty gritty why, but the basic premise is there's no guarantee that this will ever be called, ever. You can throw in whatever conditions you want in here, but React doesn't know when this should be called. It simply doesn't. Right? And so it doesn't know if it should be when the thing gets mounted to the DOM. It doesn't know if when it gets updated. It doesn't know any of that stuff because you're telling React the conditional things, and now it doesn't know how to handle it anymore. So instead of doing that, never, ever, ever wrap use effects in conditional statements like that. In fact, you'll probably get errors. That's because I refreshed. Yeah, that's not it. That's just frowned upon, basically because React can no longer determine when this thing's supposed to be called. And so your program can act really wonky if you were to do that. So instead, if you really need that conditional statement, put it inside the use effect callback.
Mel had a question, Joey.
Yep. Let's see.
How would you skip the first use effect?
Like this. Put a condition inside the callback of the use effect. And this condition, you would have to know, basically, when your component mounts to the DOM, you'll just have to know what happens when it, like if there's certain props that get passed to it initially, or if there's initially a piece of state that hasn't been updated yet, right? So if I were to say, if, okay, let's say if, no, that's bad because that's self-referencing. Let's go with props again. Let's say if props.className is a falsy value, it's not there, then I want you to set the title. And because this will only, oh, actually, no, let's leave that there. Because this will always be called when it mounts, when the component first mounts, it'll call the use effect callback, and they'll come in here and say, hey, oh, I should check this condition first. So you'll just have to, you have to be the one that determines what the condition is that you want to check for when your component mounts. Now it could be that props.class name is empty. So I should do this stuff or not do this stuff. That's how you would get around it. You have to tell it the condition of when it mounts, what it should do. But you can't, the condition has to be inside the callback. It can't be outside of it.
Is that true for all hooks
Let's see.
or just use effect?
Yes, yes, that's true. That's true. Because if you put your hooks in conditionals, React doesn't know what order they should be in. It could change the next time the component renders, right? And so you're not guaranteed to have the same state, the same effects, any of that. It's not guaranteed anymore. So any hook, you never ever wrap a conditional statement around it. If you need those conditional statements, always put them inside the hook. Because even though that hook will guarantee to be called if it's a use effect at least once. And so now it's up to you to determine what the proper action should be taken. We clear on that one? Cool. All right, so we're gonna take a break here in like 30 seconds. And then when we get back, we're going to talk more about event handling and what this stuff can do for us. Sound good? All right, so I will see you back. Let's say 7:15 good for everyone? All right, we'll come back at 7:15 and yeah, we'll see you then. All right. Everyone, like 30 seconds here. Okay. So I'm just reading some comments here. Okay, there's a question about the files that we'll be using during class versus what will change and what won't. So there was another question that was related, was can you fork this repo that I'm working on in class? And yeah, so what I'll do is I will provide a link to this. So if I provide the link now and you fork it now, you won't see any changes going forward. So what I'll do is I'll provide a link to the repo for this sandbox. That way you have access to all this stuff. So, and I won't change it. I won't go in there and change it after class is done. So it'll remain the same. And then starting next week, all of our code changes are going to live inside of the class project working folder inside of the module 6 repo. And you have the option of saving that off someplace else if you want to preserve your changes. But my plan was just to give you guys a heads up on that at the beginning. And so at the end of every class going forward, starting Monday, any changes that we do in class, I'm going to push those up to the repo so that the class project working folder will start off where the last day left off. We'll start where the last day left off. So at the beginning of class on Tuesday, all the changes from Monday will be in the class project working folder. So if you need to preserve those changes, like if you have comments or things like that, before you pull down the repository the next day, you can save those off to another folder so that you don't lose them. Because I want to make sure that everyone's on the same level playing field at the start of every day, so that we don't have to backtrack and we can all keep moving together. That way, also at the start of that day, everyone's code looks the same. So everyone has the exact same starting point.
So they'll be in the classroom code-based repository that we pull down from GitHub, as opposed to
Correct.
going to Code Sandbox and trying
Correct.
to move them into our Sandbox repository.
Correct. Yep. We're going to work. So the next 2 weeks, we'll be working solely out of the GitHub repo for Careers in Code.
Great. Thank you.
So however you want to manage your files out of that, that's however you want. But just know at the start of every class after Monday, everyone's code should look the same in that class project working folder, regardless. All right. Cool. All right. So I mentioned there was a pop quiz time. What do we use state for? What hook is this used for? Not class.
To update or make changes to the value and the function that's listed before it in the square brackets.
That's a good description of basically we're storing a piece of data, a piece of state. State can be any type of data. Yeah, so class components do this This is the equivalent of what class components utilize this dot state for. So that would be a good reference for class components. So what's inside this first variable? Any takers?
It's a value.
It's the value of our piece of
Object.
state. The value of our piece of state could be an object, could be a string,
State.
could be a number.
Okay.
Yep.
Piece
Yep.
of
So
real
title was a, yep. So that's basically our state. And this right here, what is this? This set title, what is this?
The function that is performed on that state called title.
You
When
got it.
use state is fired.
What is changing? Yeah. So the change we want to make to our state, the new value we want to plug into our state variable. So whenever we call set title, in this instance, we're passing in 3. Actually, yeah. So we pass in 3, title will become 3 if I click this, because this function updates this value. All right, cool. Very good, very good. So let's talk a little bit about event handling. I was planning on originally talking about arrays first, but because there's already an event handler on the screen, we'll continue with that and we'll talk about arrays next. So event handling is exactly like it sounds. Some event happens and we need to tell our component how to handle it. That's literally it at the base level. At this point, it's just a bunch of syntax. So let's talk about this. First of all, let's start a new component really quick, because there's a lot of stuff on the screen and I don't want it to get confusing. So we're going to close all of these windows. We'll have a new component and we'll call it form, because forms will always have some sort of event handling going on in them, right? So as you're typing into an input box, you need to handle the changes that happen in there. As you're submitting a form, we need to handle what happens, what our component does when someone submits a form, when someone clicks a submit button or clicks a radio button or whatever it happens to be. Okay. Sorry, I thought it was an emergency text. It was not. Never know when you got little kids. Okay, so we'll create a new component. We'll export const form. And just so we don't confuse it with the form elements, we'll call it my form. It can take props, just so we keep with our convention here. And we're going to return some markup. And let's return a form tag. Did you guys go over forms in HTML? Perfect, perfect. So the first thing, we'll have a form. We'll have a label. We'll just say name. This will be a quick name form. And then we'll have an input, right, with a name of name. And then we'll have, let's see, what else do we want? We want, now when you guys, did you talk about how you submit forms and different types of like inputs you can use for submitting? Did you use buttons or did you use an input element? So types of, okay, perfect, good, okay. So input type equals submit, same thing here. And then value equals submit. What? Form? Oh, self-closing. All right. So this is a very, very basic form. Like it doesn't do anything. We can type a name in and some input and click a button, but nothing's going to happen because nothing's going to happen. Well, something will happen. Let's import this into our app. I'm going to import my form from components form. Now, I broke a convention. What convention did I break? Any guesses? What am I importing? I'm importing my form from where? Yeah. I didn't name it. I didn't name it right. That would be confusing. We're going to rename that to my form. We're going to import my form from my form. So everything is copacetic there. I can instantly know what's inside this file because of its name. All right, cool. So now we'll comment out the headline since we don't need the headline, just takes up room. And then we'll render my form. Cool, we got a super simple, useless form. Type something in here, hit submit. What happened? What happened when I hit submit? This is hopefully a recap. Yeah, exactly. Right. We're not there on a so on a form submit event, if you don't give it an action, it assumes you want to reload that page and you're going to handle the form submission when it reloads. This old HTML stuff. But we're not going to do that. We don't want to do that. So do you remember how to stop it from doing that? Prevent default. Exactly. Yeah. So I'll show you how to prevent default in React. And in fact, that will be the very first event handler, just so that we're not accidentally refreshing our page all the time. So let's go over to, now we don't need to touch app.js anymore. All we needed was a reference to my form, just so it's rendered. Everything else we're going to do is going to be in this file here. All right, so how do we prevent default? Well, if you remember, I'll just start this way. In React, how you handle a form submit, there on the form tag itself, you can pass it on submit, camel cased, and that's going to be equal to a function. Okay. In fact, before I do that, let's get rid of my syntax. Let's create the actual submit function, and we'll use, say, const. We'll call it the same thing, so there's no confusion. On submit, we'll say on submit callback, because technically, no, let's do this. We'll stick with the convention that's typically out there. Handle on submit. So we're going to handle the on submit event, and that's going to be equal to a function. Okay. And inside here, every event by default will be passed an event object. And that event object tells us everything we need to know about what event just happened. If there was a submit, everything that's related to a submit event is going to be on this object here. Now, this is what's called a synthetic event object, which means this is React's version of what the DOM is doing, because we're not working in the DOM. We're working in this virtual DOM, if you remember. And the virtual DOM lives in JavaScript land that React created by itself. So we don't have the actual event that happened. What we have is a reference to the event that would have been created had it happened in the DOM before React got a hold of it. All right, so now this is a synthetic event object, but it has all the same properties that the regular DOM event would have, essentially. Right, so if we want to prevent default, we say event.prevent default. So when I click this, I can click this. Oops. Oh, because I'm not. Okay, yeah. Sorry. One more step. I need to actually pass it to my onSubmit prop right here. So onSubmit equals curlies, inside the curly braces, the name of our function. So now I can click this all day long, and the default action is going to be prevented from happening, right? We're not going to reload the page. We're not going to do any of that stuff. That's how we handle a prevent default action on a submit event. Makes sense so far? Looks pretty simple. Event handling doesn't get too much more complex than this at the base level. We're literally handling something in regards to the event that just happened, whether it's submitting something, clicking something, if we have a mouse over event, right? So, or if you're developing a React application that will be used on a touch device on touch, right? Or I think it's on touch start or on touch end, I believe are the correct things. Any type of event that can happen on an element in HTML, we can listen for those events in React land as well. So handle on submit will be fired every time the submit action happens, which means every time this input of type submit gets pressed, or every time I hit enter inside a form that has a submit, this is going to fire. And in this case, we're preventing the default action from happening. So I could actually alert what happened, submitted. And now my alert comes up. Every time I submit, this function gets called. Pretty useful, right? Now, that's great for submitting events. We're not really doing anything yet. We're just, showing an alert on the screen, not entirely useful. But at least we know how to intercept a form submission. So cool. We can, at this point, we would probably take our data and we would send it off to, whatever endpoint that's going to handle that form submit and get some responses back and yada, yada, yada. But we need some data from our form to be able to work with. So let's work on that next. So our input of type name, we want to capture this. And so we want to listen for what's called an on change event. Every time something changes, every time it's not going to let me do it because I didn't finish. But every time something in this input field changes, I want to handle that event, right? So we're going to come up here. Let's do this. Let me comment this for later. Form submit event handler. And we'll do input value change event handler. All right, so anytime the value of the input changes, this thing's going to fire, whatever this thing is. So we'll say const input on change, right? Because we're going to listen to the input. And in fact, we'll do this. We'll say name. Name input on change. Be really explicit so we know exactly what this is targeting. And that's going to have the exact same signature. It's going to be a function. That function will be passed the event, a synthetic event from that event that happened, from that change event. And then we can handle it here. So here we would say so on change equals our name input on change function, our name input on change callback, our event handler. So every time that happens, we'll have access to that change event. Well, what is on that event? Do you remember how to access the value of an input when it's been changed on the event? Does anyone remember? It's going to be what property of the input are we looking for? We're looking for the value. So inputs have a value.
On click?
No, that's an event. Yeah, event.value, right? But in React, it's a little bit different because this is a synthetic event. And React gives us this object that represents a change event. So we need to tell it exactly where that value is. And that let's do this. We'll say const input value, or we'll say const name, because that's the value we're looking for, the value of this name, equals event.target.value. So some change event happened, and that event has reference to the target of that event. Well, the target is the input element itself. That's what target means. The element that received the change. So the target element. And on that target element, I want the value of that element. At this point, it's just this right here, df, df. In fact, it's really not because I haven't, that's been sitting there. That actually hasn't changed at all. So let's do this. Let's say console.log. We would just want to console out the name. Oh yeah, because I've been doing all kinds of stuff. Let's clear that. So as I type, see how it keeps growing? Why? Because it keeps growing. It's because the value, this is the value at this time, right? So I can say J-O-E-Y. So the value of the first time it changed was J. The value of the second time it changed was J-O, so on and so forth. I think you get the point there. So every time this input receives a change event, every time the user types something, we get that event, we go to the target, we go to that input target, we grab the value, we pluck it off of there. Now we can do something with it. Well, how do I get that into a form? Like the input's there and the form. What's one way we can store a piece of data?
An array
Array is a way to do it, sure.
with objects.
In objects, yep.
Object with arrays or all around.
What did we just learn about that lets us track pieces of data inside our components?
Hooks.
Hooks, state. We can use state. We can, right? Because inside our component, we have access to all the stuff, and then we can store it as the user is working with the component. So let's pull in use state. So we'll say import use state from React. And let's store that. Let's say const, we'll say name and set name because we need a way to set the value equals use state. And we'll just put an empty string as a default value. So when this form loads, we don't want anything in our input just yet. So we want to reference just some empty piece of state. So now what we can do is we can come down to the input. We can say the value is always going to be a reference. Let me close this. Screen's getting smaller. Is my font size still okay for everyone? Okay. I tried not to change it between days. So right now, well, this component's growing too, but the value of this input will always have a reference to this name variable up here. In fact, let me comment this out because it's highlighted everything. So name is a reference to this name up here, right? So anytime this changes, the value is going to be mirrored down here. So what can we do? We could say, let's say, we'll just say value because that makes a little bit more sense here. So const value equals event.target.value. So we want the value of the input. And then what we're going to do, we're going to say set name equal to that new value. So now as I'm typing, we don't know it just yet, but name now holds the value of Joey. Let me illustrate that right here. I'm going to put an H3, why not, above everything here. And I'm going to hold the reference of name. So right there, I know for a fact that this variable of name, this piece of state, that received all the changes from this input box. So as I type, I could literally see the value being updated in state. Is that pretty clear? Any questions on that? What's going on so far? It's pretty straightforward if you look at it, right? It's like, oh, what's my cursor? Anytime there's a change, call this function. When this function gets called, it's going to be past the event that just happened. We're going to grab the value off of the target element that received that event. We're going to take that value and we're going to put it in our piece of state, and then we're going to render it. We're going to render it here, and we're going to pass it back to the input so it knows what to display as well. Because what happens if I do this? And I refresh. This is deceiving. You may think it's doing what you want, but what's happening is the browser says, oh, I see you're typing in an input box. That's cool. I'll keep your text there so you know what you typed. But the value of input is not always going to be equal to the values you're saving, because other things can happen. You could submit data, you could clear a form somewhere, and you may clear the form and that may go away, but you may still see the piece of state that has your name in it or something like that, right? It depends on what the use inputs. Yeah, so HTML is holding a reference to what you typed, but that's not necessarily what your program is utilizing at that moment in time. So to guarantee that name up here is always going to be referenced in the input box, we pass the value of that variable back down to the input element itself. That way, they'll always be in sync. You are guaranteed to know that whatever's in the input box at this moment in time is the same thing up here, guaranteed. So I would, use this pattern, right? If you want to track your data. If you don't want to do that, just know that you'll probably have weird bugs that you can't track down. You're like, I don't get it. I'm typing in this thing and this thing's not happening. And, just make sure you have a reference to it. Now, this is not a circular reference where it's going to keep going around and around and around. This value represents what gets rendered, not what gets changed, right? So this tells you what's changing, right? The value is changing. And then it says, hey, up here, set this thing. Oh, and by the way, input, make sure you update your display to whatever's in this thing, right? By telling the value, this is just a display value, really, at this point in time, right? Display what I'm telling you to display. All right. So are we good on this so far? Cool. Lots of nods. Lots of nods. Excellent. So the browser does not always accurately present the value in the code. Yeah, it's not always guaranteed to be in sync. But if you pass it the value that it needs to be in sync with, you're guaranteed that. All right, cool. So we have a growing component. There's one more thing we need to do though, and we need to submit this data, right? So how do we submit the data now? Let's, instead of submitting it somewhere, let's just alert it to the screen, because that's what our alert does now. So right now we're saying, okay, if I type in here, I type my name and I click submit, well, it's just an empty alert at this point in time. How do I get access to my data? What can I put in here to get access to my data?
Get element by ID or something like that.
This is you're gonna laugh. Ready?
Get. Oh,
Name.
that was hard.
This is, I'm already storing the value. Now I just need to access it. I can click submit. There's my name. Just like that. Except most forms are not this simple, right? What you could do, let's do this. Let's create another one. We'll call this nickname. Why not? We'll say nickname. We'll rename everything to nickname. We'll create a new one of these. Call it nickname, set nickname. Name. All right. And then we'll copy this thing here. That's another one of the things. We'll say nickname, and we'll say set nickname. So basically we did the exact same thing, except gave it a different name, right? They're both referring to different things. In fact, we can even give it that looks terrible. Let's correct that. Again, this is for illustration purposes. So I could say Joey, but maybe my nickname is Buzz. I don't know. That was actually one of my nicknames as a kid. So instead of a wording name, I could say something like, you remember template literals, right? Backticks. So now if I hit submit, I'm grabbing two pieces of form data.
Aren't they really two different things though?
They are. This is one piece of state. This is a separate piece of state.
But you're
They're-
saying it is like
What
an
I'm doing
alias
here-
almost.
Oh, well, in the context
Yeah.
of the form, yeah. So, but in as far as the code goes, I'm just referencing this value and I'm referencing this other value, but I'm combining them in such a way that when I alert this thing, I combine them together somehow. In reality, at this point, you'd probably send off, call an API endpoint and send all these different values, as parameters of that function call, right? Or send them off to the endpoint so they can be processed and stored in some database somewhere.
Okay.
But really what I
basically
wanna-
You're just declaring the different pieces that you're gonna work with. The part
Yep,
block.
that's one way we could do that. Now there's component libraries specifically made to handle forms, right? So there's a very popular library called Formik, Formik. That's a very, very popular one. I use it at work. I used it at my last job. I use it at my current job. Formik's really great. It allows you to simplify how you handle form generation and form submissions and form handling. It has ways that you can validate your form data. So if someone typed in, let's say you require at least 3 characters in a password, right? And the user only types 2, right? So there's form validation built into it that you can access. We're not going to get too much into that because like Formik would be another 3-week class. But just know that there's component libraries out there specifically for working with forms. This is the most simple, basic way you can build a form. Under the hood, this is what these libraries do. They just do a lot more of like the intricate details of all this stuff. But really all I'm trying to demonstrate here, just to separate these out, is that this is how I handle the change of this input. This is how I handle the change of this input. I'm storing them in different values so I can make a reference to them up here, right? If I were to do something like this, where I'm saying nickname, but I'm trying to store it in the same value, they're not separate anymore, right? So I need a way to separate those values out. This is just the most basic, simple way of doing that. That makes a good illustration of how event handling in forms, how you can handle data in forms, how that works, right? This is the base level. But does all this make sense? How we're handling the changes in our elements and how we're responding to those changes, how we're storing data? Does that all make sense? Okay, it does. That's good. Cool. It's pretty simple when you look at it. There's an element. When it changes, we have a callback that handles that change. We could do whatever we want with the data at that point. It's just by convention, we're storing data to submit with a form submit, but that doesn't mean you only can put event handlers on forms. You can do all kinds of other things. For example, let's say that I only want nickname to show up when I click a button. Maybe the user doesn't want to submit a nickname, and maybe it's confusing. You found that you did some research on your forms, that you did some application research, and you got a bunch of feedback from your users and they said, oh, I don't have a nickname. And every time I see the nickname field on the form, I get anxiety or something, right? 99% of users get anxious when they see a nickname. Maybe it reminds them of their past. And you're like, oh, okay, you know what? I want to cater to these users, but I also want to cater to the users that have a nickname that want to submit it. So I'll put a button on there that when I click it, then it'll show the nickname field so they can type it in later. And for the people that don't have a nickname or don't want to submit it, they don't have to show it at all. And so they feel good that they don't have to look at their old embarrassing nickname as they fill out this form. All right, so highly contrived and a lot of mental health reasons there, but just to illustrate a point. So let's do this. Let's put in, and this will actually touch on another thing that I wanted to talk about. And I need to slow my speech a little bit because I get a little excited, but conditional rendering. How do we use conditional logic to either show or hide elements inside our React applications? This is going to illustrate both how we can do that and how we can use event handling on things other than form fields. Okay. Let's see. So let's do this. Let's say I want to put a button right above nickname. That says, we'll say toggle nickname. In fact, no, we'll start with just show. We'll just say show nickname field. We'll put another break tag. So everything is, this looks awful, but it's good. It'll illustrate the point nicely. Okay, so now we have an input field. We have a button and another input field. And when we click, we want to initially when we want to hide the nickname, but only show it. Oops, there's another reason why it's doing that. Only show it when we click this button. So if you remember back to HTML, if you had a form with more than one button in it, how do you tell one button not to submit the form? Did you guys go over that?
Except that if you name button 1 and button 2 and you only fire up 1 or 2, then the other one's not going to know you fired it.
No. This is a submit button, right? I labeled it submit. It submits my form. I didn't label this one submit. It still submits my form. Does anyone know why? So you guys didn't go over this. Cool. So I can teach you something new about HTML forms. So when you have a button inside of a form, if you have a submit element in your form, any other button will also submit that form unless you give it a type of button. This says, oh, this is just a button. Don't submit my form. Okay, so now I can click this, right? It's not going to submit the form. So that's just a quick tip for you guys. That's come back to bite a lot of developers in the butt, especially in React, because you think, oh, well, here's my submit and, here's my on submit. I'm good, right? Well, no, because at the end of the day, React will generate HTML. And the way HTML forms work, there's a button in it. It's going to assume it's a submit button unless you tell it it's not. All right, so that still applies. So we'll give it a type of button so we don't submit our form with the show nickname field button. But now we want to say, okay, I only want to show this thing when it's hidden. So in order to do that, we'll start with adding a new piece of state because we want to track when and when not to show this thing. And the best piece of what's the best data type to use for knowing whether something should or should not happen? Any ideas? Yes, Booleans, true, false, old tried and true. Okay, so we're going to say show nickname, set show nickname equals use state. This is a piece of state. And we'll initially set it to false. Initially, we do not want to show this thing. So show nickname, this variable state name show nickname, this constant, will have a value of false when this component mounts to the DOM. Cool. So we need to tell, this thing not to display when that's false and only to display when that's true. How do you think we can, any ideas on how we could wrap some logic around this to evaluate some JavaScript? What could we put in here? All right, so we're going to use curly braces because curly braces tells JSX, hey, we're evaluating some JavaScript now. So let's do this. We're going to put in some curly braces, or we're going to say, hey, if show nickname is true, we want to show it, otherwise don't. And how we can do that is by using this syntax right here, double ampersand, which is a logical and. Do you guys remember logical or, logical and? Perfect, cool. So if this is true, then we're going to wrap this entire thing around here. Oops. And it's not going to work. And there's a very good reason why. When you return, and this is a great thing that I wanted to touch on yesterday that I forgot to because kind of ran out of time. But when at the end of the day, JSX is a function, right? Underneath the hood, it's a React creates functions for these things because it's just JavaScript. How many things can you return from a function? One thing. How many things am I returning in this function? 2. I'm returning a label element, and I'm returning an input element. I can't do that. I can only return one thing at a time. So React, since again, it's just functions underneath, we have to tell it, oh, I want both of these things. So I'm going to have to put them inside something else. So I only return one thing. How can I do that? Well, the quickest way to do it is to wrap them both in a div or some other element. What am I returning from this expression? I'm returning a single div. It just so happens that inside that div, there's 2 other children, right? But that's okay because the parent element is a single thing, so I can return it. Does that make sense? Seeing a lot of head nodding. Awesome. Cool. So now I'm returning a single div with some children that happens to be my other form fields. So now, obviously it's working. If I change this to true, now I can see my nickname field. But by default, I want that to be false. So now I come back to my event handler. I need an event handler to know when the user clicked this button. So I can give my button an on-click event handler. And then we'll create that up here. Am I scrolling too fast? Hopefully I'm not going too fast. All right, so what I'll do is I'll try to slow down a little bit with my scrolling and things like that. So we're going to create a new function. We're going to label it. We're going to say button on click event handler. You know exactly what it's for. We're going to say handle button on click. What gets passed to my event handler? My event. I see people saying event, but I can't hear you, so that's kind of funny. All right, so I've got an event that comes in here, right? But now here's the thing with button clicks. I don't necessarily care about what's on that event. There's no target value I'm looking for. I just want to know when it was clicked. So I technically don't even really need to do anything with this particular event. Since form fields have values in them, I definitely want to know, right? But typically when you see click handlers, a lot of times it'll just be empty here because you don't need to do anything with that event. It already fired. So this function is definitely going to be invoked, but we don't need to do anything with the actual event unless you really wanted to know which button was clicked. But you kind of already know which button is clicked because we're going to pass it right to the button itself. So handle on, or I'm sorry, handle button on click. So when we click this button, this function is going to fire. And any idea what I should do when I click that, or when that button gets clicked, what should I do with my piece of state? Any ideas? What do I need to do to show nickname? I need to set it to true, right? So I could say set show nickname to true. So when I click this, hey, there's my nickname. So this updates my piece of state. That piece of state gets set to true. This evaluates to true. So this thing gets rendered. That's how we do conditional rendering in React. So if you want to hide or show something, you can use logic and event handlers to handle when that stuff is hidden or shown. And just like this. Now, let's say you wanted to hide it again. Maybe the user's like, oh, you know what? I really don't want to type that in. That's a really simple fix. All I have to do is when I update show nickname, I just tell it to do the opposite of what the current value is, because it's either going to be true or false. So I can say it's not, but it's the opposite, right? So not show nickname is, if it's false, it's true. If it's true, it's false. So now when I click this, in fact, I'll just call this toggle nickname, because now it's a valid thing. Now I can toggle it on and off. I can come up in here. And there we go. Where are we doing on time? Doing pretty good. All right, cool. So any questions so far on event handling? This is the meat and potatoes of event handling right here. All you need to know is what events are available to you on different types of elements. So buttons have change events, or I'm sorry, inputs have change events. Buttons have click events. Divs have on mouse over, on mouse leave, right? So any sort of like native HTML DOM event, we have access to in here. You just have to know which events are available to which elements, right? Typically, now this is an HTML element. I don't believe on change is the official. I think it's on input or something like that. I haven't done native HTML event handling in a long time. But just know that for React, anytime you have some sort of like input element where the value can change, you're going to use on change. It pretty much handles all the base case for all of your input elements, whether it's a select, it's an input, it's a radio, it's the, even checkbox would be an on change as well, right? Let's see. So anytime you have an element that's an input device, on change is going to be your friend. And then when that event fires, your callback that you assign it will be called. And your callback is always going to be passed this event, which is a synthetic JavaScript DOM event. It's a synthetic event. And that event has all the details of the thing that just happened. It has the target, which is your element itself. That target has the value. The other thing you can do is you can see which element. So let's say you can use the same event handler for like 5 different inputs on your page. But how would you know which one clicked? You could look at event.target.name. Oh, I see The nickname was the one that happened. Oh, the name, oh, the last name, oh, the first name. So event.target's your friend, especially when you want to be efficient. So this comes back to like the verbose stuff. If I wanted to be really efficient with this, I could do, let me do this. Let me comment this out. And I'm going to create a generic event handler. Let's say const handle input change, right? I'm not telling it which one. I grab an event. Okay. Now I'm going to take this. I'm going to plug it here and here. So both inputs are going to be handled by the same event handler callback. How do I know which one was fired? Well, let's take a look at the event. I could say const input name equals event.target.name. I know exactly which one was clicked now. So it's all that data is available on that event. So now I can log it out for now. And we'll just say, I want to see which one was changed. So let's go to our console. In fact, I'll show. No, it's not letting me do that because did I put it on the wrong? I put it on the wrong thing. This is handle button. Sorry. Yeah, well, it helps if you put the event handler on the same element. See, nobody's perfect. I'm not perfect. All right. So perfect. So now now it's perfect. So let's see. So now I can say Joey. I see this was the name. I could put Buzz in here. Now you notice it's not updating. Why isn't it updating? Well, the display value is tied to these specific pieces of state, right? But I know which one's happening right down here. I can clearly see it. I can go back and forth, right? I know what event or what the target element was that received that event. So where are we? Right here. So now I can say, okay, because this is a very small form, I can get away with this. I could say if input name equals name, then I want to set name equal to what? Event target dot value. If input name is equal to nickname, same thing. Set nickname to the event target's value. Now we can clearly see that our values are going to the right piece of state. And I'm using a single event handler to do it. I'm no longer doing all of this stuff, right? I'm a lot more streamlined and being a lot more efficient, right? All my logic is packed in right here instead of over instead of over, what is this? 10 lines of code. I have, well, probably 10, but I don't need separate event handlers to handle this. What if I have 50 input fields? You think I want to create a single one of these for every input field? No, I got better things to do with my time, right? So I'll create a single event handler to handle all of them. And then I'll check the logic. I'll use the logic to check the event target's name to see which one happened. Now, I would not do if statements in that case. I would figure out a different data structure. I'd use an object, right? I could say, oh, well, this object's name property is now going to be name. This object's nickname's property is going to be this name, nickname. So there's a lot of options you can have at this point in time. If I wanted to really hurt myself, I could put if else's and all kinds of other stuff like that, or I could find a more efficient way to do it. So instead of handling or having all these event handlers for every single thing, you can get away with one that handles multiple things. And it's up to you to be how efficient you want to be inside of this function. Makes sense? My voice is cracking. We're good there? Okay, perfect. So this brings us, that's event handling. That's it. That's all you really need to know. Everything else is just figuring out what events are out there, right? So all the different, look up the different types of events that are available for you on HTML elements, and you'll have them already in React as well. Cool. So the last thing we're going to talk about today, because it's all we're going to have time for, is working with arrays. The data array data types inside of React. Super important because they're super useful. So I'm going to save this file. And again, I'll make sure that I copy this over to the link for the repo over to the Slack chat. So let's do this. Let's create a new component because this form's getting out of control. Forms are always out of control. You're going to learn that real quick. Forms are like the most tedious things in the world. Let's see. Unless you love creating form component libraries, then they're awesome. Which I actually have created a form component library, and it's actually a lot of fun. You get to learn about, validation and all kinds of cool stuff. So let's call this, I don't know. Oh, I know. Let's do this. We'll call this list. Perfect. Lists are just, that's what an array is. It's a list of things. So that's perfect. So we'll say export const list is a new function or new component, function component. It receives props. We may or may not use props for this. We're going to return some JSX markup. We'll have, let's see, we'll start with a div, just so we have a single element to return. At the top, we'll just put like an H2. We'll say my list, something generic, just to render something to the screen. That's all we want to see right now. That's another thing that it's another good habit to get into is when you're creating new components, render something really simple, just so that you can make sure that you can import it and view it properly somewhere in your application. So let's comment out my form. I'm not going to delete it, so you can uncomment it later. And we're going to import list because it's a named import. We're using curly braces from components list. Let's throw some angle brackets around it. Boom, we got a list. Fantastic. A list with nothing in it. Our to-do list is empty. We're done. All right, so we don't need app.js open anymore. All right, so in fact, we'll call this my to-do list. Why not? We need a list of things to do. So let's create a variable. In fact, we'll create it outside of the component, not inside. We're going to create it outside, just so you can see that as long as that value is within the same file, that variable is accessed within the same file, you have access to it in your components. This is good for like creating test data. So we'll say to-dos equals a list of things. And we could say we're going to learn React. We're going to get better at React. React is now in our dreams. Will now be in our dreams. Okay, so I've dreamt about React a lot. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but yeah, I write it all day long. I dream about it. All right. So these are our to-dos. And now we need to render this array of things inside our component. Well, React technically knows how to handle arrays. So if we think back to the very first thing I showed you guys, where it says react.create element, and then we give it a tag, some props, and some children, we can pass an array of things to that children parameter, and it'll know how to handle it. Technically, that can happen here too. It's not the most efficient thing, but it's possible. So let's do this. We'll just say, hey, because it's JavaScript, we have to evaluate it. To-dos. hey, there's my stuff. Doesn't look very pretty, right? Yeah, it's a list of things, but how do we know it's a list? Well, you just see text, right? How do we typically render lists to in HTML? We have a couple of choices. We have ordered lists, we have unordered lists. So we'll use an unordered list because we're not necessarily going to do all these in this order. We may dream about React before we get better at it. Who knows? So what does a UL take? It takes LIs, right? List items. So we would do like this, right? Got a list item. And it's like, oh, okay, well, now it's like, okay, well, how do I get my array of, like, how do I convert an array of things into a bunch of list items? So check this out. Did you guys go over map? Array.map, array.filter, stuff like that. Okay, perfect. Map is your friend. You're going to use map a lot, especially with arrays. And I'll show you why. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to type it out and then I'll explain it. So we're going to say to-dos, because it's an array, I have access to the map function on it. We're going to get a to-do item for every to-do. We're going to return a list item. And inside that list item, we'll have a to-do. Now, hold on 1 second. All right. That was getting ridiculous. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, let's break it down. First thing we see are some curly braces. We're inside JSX, so we know we're going to be evaluating some JavaScript. Next thing we have is an array of things. So we have array functions accessible to us. We can do map, we can do filter, we can do reduce, all kinds of things. We're going to choose map because what map does is it goes over every single element in array and it returns a new copy of that array with something in it, right? So if I were to say, let me show a really quick example. I'm going to open up a new browser tab just to illustrate this because it's very important. If I have an array, so I'm going to say var to-dos, let's do numbers because numbers are easier to explain. So var nums equals an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, and then I could say nums.map, and I give it a callback, right? So for every number, I want to return an array where every number is doubled. So I will say I'm going to return num times 2.
Can you make the text bigger?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That window?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
How's that? So what map does is for every element in the array, it makes a new array, but what it returns is whatever's in the callback, whatever you tell it to return. So what I'm saying is for every element in this array, I'm going to map over it. For each number, I'm going to multiply that number by 2 and return it. So the array that comes back, every element is this brand new value, which is a squared value. Does that make sense? Let me show it another way, just in case. I can't see everyone's camera, so I can't see if people are shaking their heads. So let's do this. No new comments. Okay, good. We're gonna say var names equals, we'll say Joey, Karen. So there's 2 names in here, and we're gonna say names.map, and for every name, I want to put CIC in front of it. So now when I map over this, I've manipulated every single element in this array, and now I have new values for every element. With me so far? That's the power of map. Just one of its superpowers. Okay, so now how does that apply here? Well, we have a to-dos array, which is an array of strings. We want to convert those into something. We want to mutate that thing. So for every to-do, we're going to return an li element with the to-do inside of it. And the reason this is in curlies, because this part's JSX. We can return JSX because JSX gets compiled down to a function, and we can return functions because functions can be returned like any other value. So JSX can be returned from a function the same way we're returning JSX from this component. Same thing, except now we're returning a list element with the to-do from my original array inside of it. So React's going to say, oh, okay, I see. So I'm going to take this array, and for every one of these elements, I'm going to create an li tag, put it inside of it, and that's how it renders here. Did everyone get that? I see lots of nodding heads. I see one sort of shaking head. Okay. Let me do it this way. Let's cut this out. Let's put in a function where we get our to do. And we're going to return. We'll do the exact same syntax that we see above. Same thing. Now it's not an arrow function, but we're returning JSX here. Oops. We're returning JSX here. We're returning JSX here. But in this case, we're returning an array of JSX things. React knows how to handle arrays, so it renders it to the screen. But what it's rendering is a list tag for every single to-do element. We good? Cool. However, we have a problem. It's not apparent to us, but it might be apparent down here. Oh, it's this warning. Each child in a list should have a unique key prop. This is very important to React. I'll tell you why. When you have a list of things that you're rendering in a React element or in a React component, let's say it's a list of stuff that came from your database, and it has to be in a very specific order, right? So ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 500, right? You've got 500 things. Let's say they're all rendered. They come back from the database in alphabetical order, and that's how you display it on your page. Well, I'm rendering 500 things in alphabetical order. React says, hey, you got this array. That's cool. What if I make a change to that array? I'm going to render a new array with the new changes. And React's going to say, oh, you're rendering a new thing. Let me compare it to what you had before. The order's changed. What should I do? React doesn't know, right? It doesn't, frankly, it doesn't care. All it cares about is comparing what you had before to what you have now. So if you change a few of those values, React's going to go, oh, I see, element 5 changed, element 6 changed, but what if you returned it in reverse alphabetical order? Oh, that's a problem. It doesn't know the order it had before. All it knows is there was an array of 500 elements. It doesn't know what's in it. So in order to tell React, hey, this is a very specific order, we need to tell, we need to say, hey, each one of these list elements needs a unique identifier. So React can say, oh, I see what you did. You reversed the order, and now this element's over here. Cool, I got you. Now I can update my screen, and I can do it efficiently in the way that you expect it to be rendered. So to do that, when you're rendering an array of things, always give the top level element a key prop. That's the unique value. What do we give it? Well, it all depends. If this was a database of things, I would give it the ID from that database. So let's say, let's see. If I have a database of records, in order for those to be stored efficiently in a database, they need a unique identifier. So I can use that. Let's say that it was todo.id, right? In this case, it's not, but let's say it was. That's a unique identifier. I could definitely use that. In my case, this is a very small array, but I need to give it that key prop. Otherwise, React's going to complain to me. So what I can do is the map function gives you three things, 4 things. I think it's 3. I got to look it up. But it does give you at least 2 items. The first is the actual element in the array that it's iterating over. The second thing it gives you is the index where that element exists. So right now, when this gets rendered out, the first li is going to have a key of 0. The second li is going to have a key of 1. Third li key of 2, so on and so forth. That's enough to make React stop complaining. And so we won't get that thing in our console anymore. Those are now unique IDs. Now, they're not really unique IDs like the thing I just described, because the order of this can change, so it doesn't really know. But since this is a very small list of things, we don't really care. We just want to know that, hey, yeah, this is index 0, 1, and 2. That satisfies React, but it also tells React, hey, if for some reason this does change, I have a better chance of getting it right when I render it next time, right? In most cases, when you're rendering things out, it's typically things like records in a database or results from some API call. And it's typically an array of objects, right? So you've got, in fact, let's do that. Let's do a different type of to-do. We'll say to-do records. Let's say they live on our database. Oops, sorry. It's an array of things where there's a very unique ID.
Your records is spelled wrong. You're missing an R. There you go.
Oh, I've got some fish in here, some cods, man. All right, so ID 123, we'll say value, learn React. All right, and we'll do the same thing. We'll do 2 of them, just so it saves typing. Learn more React. But this is a unique identifier. So I've got a very unique ID and a very unique ID. So now I can come down here. Instead of to-dos, I have my to-do records. But I can't render an object, so I have to say to-do dot value. And now I don't need the index anymore because I have a unique identifier. I could say to-do dot ID. I am guaranteed to know that when React renders my stuff, it knows exactly which record is which. And if something changes on the screen, it can be super efficient in re-rendering my stuff. Does that all make sense? When it comes down to it, the biggest things you need to remember about arrays is that when you need to create elements, we map over them. And we need to give each one a unique identifier using the key prop. The biggest 2 takeaways. Everything else is just details of how you want to handle the rendering of it, right?
Wait,
now,
can you repeat what you just said? Sorry, I was writing the notes and then.
Oh, sure. So biggest 2 takeaways for arrays in React: map over them, return things that React knows how to render efficiently, like elements, and then give each one of those elements a unique identifier. So React knows how to re-render those things efficiently in case they change, especially when you're working with data from databases. Alphabetical order is a great example. That can go wrong real quick. People are like, what? Why are there Z's in my C's? I don't get it. So that's the biggest thing with arrays. But essentially, and here's another cool thing. I can render whatever I want here. It doesn't have to be a single element. Let's say I have a very special list element that has extra logic built into it. We'll say const special list item. And that's a component. And it takes props. I'm going to return some JSX markup, which is a list element, but inside that list element, there's a button. All right, this is just for illustration purposes. So you don't really need to follow along with this other than the final thing I do with it. So I'm going to say props dot, oops, sorry. We need to evaluate it. Props dot value update props.value. Okay, so I have this component, right? I can now render a component here for every single one of my elements. And I just need to tell it that looks ugly, but illustrates the point, right? It doesn't have to be a single element. I can render components. I can have an array of databases or database records. And if I'm in a table, I could render an array of table rows that are their own components with buttons to update the record in the database, right? So I can render anything in my array, anything that React knows how to render, I can put in here. Super powerful, especially when you're creating tables and lists and all kinds of things, or even menu items, right? I could render this inline, and I could render a React element for every menu item across the top of my screen with the very same component. The only thing that changed were the values in the array that I'm using. Does that make sense? See, small nods. So there's actually three big takeaways. There's map over arrays to return something that React knows how to render. Make sure you pass it. Oh, we didn't do that. Key equals. I didn't have my console open, so I didn't see the warning. Pass it a unique identifier. And the third big takeaway is you can render anything React knows how to render here. Element, component, plain text, a number, whatever. In fact, inside here, you could have additional conditional logic. You can go down a big rabbit hole with this, right? Arrays, super powerful, super powerful. All right, so we are at time. Any last questions before I save this and copy the link over to the sandbox or to the chat? Office hours. Yes. So let me put that in Slack. How does everyone feel about Fridays? Are they good with Fridays?
We're good. I mean, I'm good with Fridays, but we also have career coaching with Laura tomorrow.
Okay. This particular Saturday, my kid has a dance competition. At the same time, we would typically have office hours, like between 11 and 12. How are people with Sundays?
I'm not available on Sunday, but I can always rewatch on YouTube.
Okay, we can also do, how long is office hours typically?
It's an hour long.
Sometimes
it's an hour. Okay.
Depends on what people need or, yeah. We also, I don't know if anyone else has signed up for this, but Jesse's doing another one of his half-hour office things on Friday at 5 to 5:30, and then of course the career thing at 6. Just I don't know if anyone else.
Good heads up, Carolyn, because I definitely forgot about Jesse.
Yeah, and last time I came in late and it was already over because I totally spaced off the time because I was busy coding. Oh yeah.
You can always put a poll in Slack, Joey. Like pick a couple.
Yeah, let's do that
for you, and then just go with majority rules.
Yeah, and Saturday's not good for you anyway, so it doesn't matter that I have a couple of things then. So
it would have to be Saturday in the evening.
Okay.
I'll throw some times up.
Yeah.
Poll, and I'll see.
Yeah.
And if Jesse is cool with it, maybe I could do 2 of them, one on each day or something like that, if it helps people out. I know we're kind of limited in how much time we're allowed to do. But
I think actually you are allotted 2 hours a week for office hours.
Oh, so we could do an hour one day and one another day.
Yeah, I think
I'll double check with Jesse. Yeah.
Looking at when you look at the timesheet, I'm pretty sure it says 2 hours for the week.
Oh, weekend project. That's right.
That's cool.
I've got some weekend homework for you guys. It's a code sandbox repo, so you'll have to fork it. And then the instructions are, if you got a good look at the code sandbox repo that you forked from last night, that homework one, it's set up the same way but it's called exercises. And each one of the exercises in there is a topic that we went over this week. And it's just going to have you create the things. Okay.
Is that the one that we did? Well, I created it and then you wanted us to link it. It's on that one, right? And then send you the link yesterday.
Same.
And the
Yeah. Well,
assignments-
it's not the exact same one.
Oh, okay. Because I saw that there was
It's-
assignment 1, 2, and 3 in there. So I was just double checking.
Oh, no, it's a different sandbox, but it's set up the same way. You still have to go into the source folder and inside the exercises folder and look inside the component files to see what the instructions are. It's set up the exact same way. It's just a different set of problems to solve. So
No worries, we're pros now at this point. Kidding.
The one yesterday was like your homework for the week, right? Like every night, homework that you would get every night, but it's not due till the end of the week.
The one I assigned, the one I had you copy last night, is due at the end of the 3 weeks of React. So by that time, you should be able to solve what's in there. The one that I'll assign for this weekend is specifically the stuff we went over this week. All the basics.
That's good.
All right. So I chunked it out. So you only have to handle one little basic at a time. And then the other one is basically all the basics put together to create all these different things.
We're all kind of going along with that as part of what we're doing as a group anyway.
Yeah. Cool.
So, right. So some of that's actually just kind of getting done by virtue of the fact that we're doing it together.
Yeah. So some of this is going to feel like, oh, we already went through this through class. That's good, because then you'll have a good mental model of what you need to do over the week. So let me first, I'm going to go into CIC students C2. This is the repo from class. So that's the repo from class. I just saved it, so you should be able to fork it. And then I'll create a Google homework assignment for the weekend, and I'll post the link to the repo for that one.
And to Google Classroom, right?
To the Google, yeah, the Google Classroom assignment will have the weekend assignment.
Got it.
Okay. Any last questions? I think there was one more thing in chat that I think I missed.
Still haven't found Waldo.
I gave up on Waldo, man. He's not a developer. What can you do for me?
Yeah, my son went out of town the weekend with some friends to Ohio, and they stopped at a convenience store, and he took a picture, and it was, stuffed Waldo. And he's like, we found Waldo. That's why I even went on my brain.
Oh, that was a comment Karen made. Okay.
Oh yeah, my big comment. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, I thought that was a very long question. I'm like, oh, I'll have to get back to that.
No, it's a big comment of just, like it was a lot to absorb today, and just rewatch it, stop it, write notes, do whatever, code.
So I will tonight assign the homework and get a poll. I'll create a poll by the end of tonight sometime, and then see what people think, and then we'll go from there. All right, so just as a show me a thumbs up if you're feeling good so far about what we've gone over, and maybe some other icon if you're like, oh my gosh, what is this?
Pretty good. I mean, I gotta look it over and think about it, and my brain wasn't absorbing much tonight, but it almost,
yeah, it's a lot, right?
It seems easier in some ways than all the stuff before this. I don't know. My brain's getting used to it.
Yeah, so the way I see React is it's really just a bunch of other technologies kind of like conglomerated into one. So we have HTML, right? It looks like HTML. It gets rendered down to HTML, right? So we've got that concept. Styling, we've got that concept already. JavaScript, we've got that concept for the most part, right? We know what JavaScript is. We know there's a lot to JavaScript, but at the end of the day, React is just a JavaScript library. So all you're really creating is JavaScript, but you're doing it in a way that feels like you're already working with HTML, stuff like that. So the more you practice JavaScript and the more you practice HTML, the better you get at React. Because it just builds on top of it.
Don't forget your feedback form tonight.
Yes, feedback forms, please. There was some good good suggestions in there.
CIC, and it was in the chat.
All right, so I'm going to stop the YouTube.